Jaguars tight end Evan Engram, he had said that he hopes to see more deep targets in 2024. He accounted for 24% of the Jaguars' targets last year, but only 14% of the team's air yards. His A dot last year was 5, even though he was the most targeted tight end by 16 targets. The year prior was just 6.1. Pete, I'll go to you first on this one. I mean, and also among tight ends last year with 100 plus targets, only David Njoku had a smaller A dot than Evan Engram. We all think Evan Engram is going to be a good tight end, but is there any reason to believe that his deep targets could increase just because he hopes that they do? I mean, it's kind of been the same in his 2 years in Jacksonville. What says you, Pete?
I would hope his deep targets increase because I don't think we're going to see the volume that we saw last year. What I would say about the offense from last year is it's nice in a way when it comes to tight ends where it provides good matchups in space, which is where Evan Engram kind of thrived last year. It allowed him to kind of get open just because they moved the tight end around a little bit. I expect the offense to be better overall. So where Evan Engram may see a downgrade in volume of targets, which I do expect that to happen with Kirk, Brian Thomas, Gabe Davis. I think the quality of targets will go up. I think this offense reminded me a lot, and it's going to sound weird until I explain the full point. It reminded me a lot of the Eagles offense last year in that, the Eagles were just on cruise control for like a year and a half, and then finally they got hit in the mouth and they didn't adjust, right? Just a vanilla offense.
In the mouth, by the way. Who hit them in the mouth?
Well, I think the 49ers did. But just a vanilla offense where just not a lot of motion, not a lot of movements. Teams were just matching up, head up. And it was easy to kind of sniff it out, right? And there wasn't a lot of creativity. That's what we saw with the Jaguars last year. Once Christian Kirk went down, they tried to put Calvin Ridley in that role, and Calvin Ridley he just wasn't successful. So just a really bland vanilla offense with a bad offensive line that got decimated by injuries. I think overall the offense is going to be better. There's going to be more creativity, more movement, which should help. And so I think Evan Engram is going to be a guy that he's just going to be a good value this year, man. Like, it is crazy to think that he finished as the tight end 2, I believe, last year. And I think he's going off the board at like close to tight end 11. No, probably. I think tight end
7 in the
tight end
FFPC.
But still, it's still great. Yeah,
that's a guy that, like, if you miss on the top tier players, like, that's the next guy I want. Like, once Pitts is gone, like, if it's between Kittle, Ferguson, and Ingram, like, I think, it for me, it'd be hard to choose between Ferguson and Ingram in a redraft best ball format. I understand Kittle's upside because he's got those big games that he provides, but it's just hard from a week by week start. But Ingram and Ferguson are the next two guys that I'm attacking at that tier that I'm hoping I don't miss out on if I miss out on the first couple of guys. So
yeah, except that it gets a little scary. Except for Anthony, who loves to dumpster dive for tight ends and always seems to come out okay. But Anthony, what says you on Evan Engram here and these possible deep targets?
I'm a little bit worried about Evan Engram fantasy this year. Tight end 7 off the board. You bring up deep targets. He was actually 3rd amongst tight ends last year in deep targets. He had 8. What concerns me is that he was 14th in red zone targets. He only had 10 red zone targets, caught 7 of them, and only 4 touchdowns. Back-to-back years in Jacksonville, only 4 touchdowns. If we look at his target share, 2022, he had 98 targets. That takes a bump up to $143 last year. Well, why? I believe Christian Kirk missed some time, and that's when Evan Engram saw his most targets. Now we cue in, they bring in the rookie Brian Thomas. You bring in Gabe Davis, who's a deep threat, and now we have Christian Kirk. Travis Etienne. I don't know if Evan Engram, like if we're drafting Evan Engram this year, thinking he's going to get another 143 targets, I'm pumping the brakes there. He was extremely PPR dependent, 114 receptions. No wonder why he finished as a tight end too. When we look at efficiency, wasn't the most efficient player in the world. Now he was second in yards after catch, but 31st in yards per target, 34th in yards per reception, and A.34th. So they didn't really use him as a deep threat. He created a lot of his yards on his own, which is all well and good, but I just don't know if they view him as the player they think he is. Not saying he's not capable of being a deep threat, but you don't bring in Gabe Davis and draft Brian Thomas to go send your tight end deep. If this offense is clicking the way it did in 2022, I think we're drafting Evan Engram right around his floor. I'm not reaching for him. I'm drafting guys like, Kyle Pitts is one spot ahead, but I'll gladly take Kyle Pitts over Evan Engram. And I think I might even take guys like Jake Ferguson over Evan Engram, because there's a path where Jake Ferguson gets a lot more targets this year with Dallas not addressing that wide receiver room and actually losing Tony Pollard, who was their best pass catching back. So there is a path for increased opportunity for Jake Ferguson, who was number one amongst tight ends in red zone opportunities. So I just see a lot more, like, why are we drafting Evan Engram? That's where, I see him.
The only thing I would push back on slightly is that Jacksonville was 21st in terms of just red zone touchdowns in the NFL last year. So the offense as a whole was down on touchdowns. So it could be, I just think the whole offense as a whole was just not gelling well. So I don't want to hold Engram.
Even
I understand your points.
He was 19th in red zone targets.
And in 2022, they were also extremely low. Yeah. No, well, in terms of 2022, their red zone scoring was middle of the pack, about 15, 16. So this just hasn't been an offense that knows how to score in the red zone regardless. And Travis Etienne has been pretty much their main guy in the red zone. So I think your point is valid, Anthony. I think I'd probably do lean Ferguson just because we know what this offense can do. They can put the ball in the end zone. I just think it's a matter of, does Jacksonville finally put it together this year? And I don't know. We'll see.
But if they put it together, is that going to be because of Evan Engram, or is he going to be a safety blanket? Now, Evan Engram, where he does draw some value in PPR, since he's been in Jacksonville, he's been the number one tight end in slot snaps in back-to-back years. But obviously, last year, Christian Kirk only played 12 games. That's where we see that increase in targets for Evan Engram. So if we get a full year out of Christian Kirk, if Brian Thomas, let's say they hit on Brian Thomas,
sure.
Where are these targets for, where do we see his target share?
There's no, even the discussion about the deep targets is, and Anthony, you said this, that we're not seeing 143 targets again.
Barring injury to Kirk. I do see a world where it happens if Kirk goes down.
Every single conversation we could have on this podcast from here until the end of time, when we close the doors on this show, it'll always say barring injury. That's always a thing. So some people seem to think that there's some ways where you can bypass the foreseen, and you could still give good analysis, but that's not really possible actually in real life, unless you're Dr. Emmett Brown and you've got the DeLorean. But Anthony knows what I'm talking about. But Pete, do you have any other final points on that?
Yeah. The crazy thing is Evan Ingram's target share, right? Like prior to Christian Kirk getting hurt, he had 7 games of 8 or more targets even before Kirk went down. Now he had some spikes, 15, 13, 12 in games where Kirk was gone, but then he had 2 games with 6. So that kind of evens out kind of where he was in terms of, like, I don't think his targets were spiked in some weeks, but overall, like, the average amount of targets he was getting in those games Kirk was gone, if you add in the 2 6 weeks, there's a chance that he's still kind of a little bit, he's pretty much at that level that he was already at before Kirk went down. But I think at the end of the day, the last point I'll say is that it's a matter of, like I said, if the amount of targets goes down, but the offense is moving and they're quality targets, and this offense can get going, I'll feel more confident. But to Anthony's point, there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. Gabe Davis is a red zone target as well. We've seen him score in the red zone, right? Brian Thomas is a big guy. Like, he'll probably be a red zone target as well. So, he could be playing fourth fiddle in terms of you have Travis Etienne, Gabe Davis, and Brian Thomas, all three of them possibly in front of him in terms of guys that Lawrence is looking at. So I don't know, but I know they're comfortable because obviously Lawrence looks his way. If that can stay the same this year coming up and the offense is better, hopefully he can, fall into the end zone a few times.
It's also which was mentioned at one point in the chat here. It is also a Doug Pearson offense, which always bodes well for tight ends.